Hello, my lovely anatomist and physiologist, Michele Glass here. We're still talking about our ascending tracts. Remember, we can think about these as fiber optic cables transmitting sensory information from the body through these tracts, that's like the cable, up to the brain for processing. So ascending tracts, sensory information carrying body, sensory information from the body up to the brain. Tracts, remember, are bundles of myelinated axons in the central nervous system. And we're looking at our picture of our transverse cut of our spinal cord. We have the white matter on the very outside, and highlighted within these different sections of white matter, we have our tracts. So this is going to be these different cables that we're seeing running through the spinal cord. And so what we're talking about is sensory information being brought in through that, remember, dorsal root, or we probably called it posterior root. So let me make that correction. And this is sensory information coming in, and then it's going to make its way to one of these tracts, right? One of these pathways so it can get its way to the brain. So what I'd like to do next is actually draw out on a diagram these different tracts or pathways. So I'm going to be using this kind of a picture to sort of try to simplify and make these drawings. So you may want to do a pause on your screen and take a few minutes to replicate this. We have 4 tracks, so you may want 4 versions of this, or you may just kind of make a super messy one. So what I have drawn here is sort of maybe like a mushroom shape structure, and so kind of like the bellar body of the mushroom, or maybe it's kind of like a lamp, like a floor lamp maybe. That top kind of part is representing the cerebrum, and I have listed an area called the primary somatosensory cortex, which I've reminded you is located in the postcentral gyrus. And then I have kind of a circular area that I've labeled as the thalamus. Remember, that's our relay center. That's part of the diencephalon. And then I've made the stick. So I have a section that I've just called brainstem, and then I have a section that I've called spinal cord on that stick. So maybe it's just like a kind of like a half of a lollipop. And then hanging off of the brainstem, I do have an area that I've labeled cerebellum. So you'll want to do that as well. And then notice I have my sensory neuron, which is shown in red. It's called a first order sensory neuron, and I have it drawn as a unipolar neuron. So remember, that means the dendrite becomes continuous with the axon, but I have the cell body kind of sticking out to the side. And my cell body I've positioned in what is labeled as the spinal ganglion, right? So what we're seeing here is that the first order sensory neuron is going to be collecting the sensory information. It's going to come in that posterior, it's going to come in the spinal nerve to the posterior root. This cell body will be located in the spinal ganglion, and then is coming into the spinal cord. So let's begin by drawing our anterior spinothalamic tract. And one of our important pieces of information from our anterior spinothalamic tract is that it's collecting crude touch and pressure information. So down here, the first order sensory neuron is collecting from a receptor, or maybe it's the free nerve ending or an encapsulated nerve ending. It's going to be collecting the crude touch and pressure information from the body traveling this spinal nerve into the dorsal root, coming into the spinal cord. So this is our definition of our first order neuron. Now, in the case of our anterior spinothalamic tract, we put in our table that decussation is going to happen at the spinal cord level. So I'm going to draw in white a neuron where I'm going to put the cell body synapsing onto my red first order sensory neuron. I'm going to show it coming into the spinal cord and then traveling all the way up to the thalamus. Now this neuron here is going to be called a second order sensory neuron. We can also talk about it as an interneuron because this second order sensory neuron is going to then synapse onto what we're going to call our third order sensory neuron at the thalamus. And so our third order sensory neuron is going to then take that information from the thalamus and direct it to the proper part of the primary somatosensory cortex. And so we can call this our third order sensory neuron. The third order is always located in the thalamus, so we can also call it the thalamic neuron. And so once we get it to the thalamic neuron, that neuron is directing it to the proper part of the primary somatosensory cortex for processing. So this is our anterior spinothalamic tract, where we have 3 sensory neurons. So this is an example of serial processing, bringing in this information. We have crossover happening, remember, at the spinal cord level. And that's the whole story. Now we can actually just real quickly modify this drawing to represent the lateral spinothalamic tract. So maybe what you do is just change color. And so I'm going to change color. I'm going to grab a green color because I don't have any green on my screen. And so now I'm going to, in green, label this as my lateral spinothalamic tract. And the only thing that I have to do different in this type of diagram is this is my pain and temperature. And the rest of the picture stays the same. Now, of course, this is located in a different part of the spinal cord. The lateral spinothalamic tract would be in the lateral white column. We've already talked about that. And of course, the other key difference is that we're collecting different kind of sensory information. It's pain and temperature traveling together in that first order sensory neuron, which is part of the spinal nerve, coming into the posterior root, coming into the spinal cord and synapsing onto the second order sensory neuron. And it's the second order sensory neuron that crosses at the spinal cord level and then ascends up to the thalamus, where it synapses onto the third order sensory neuron or thalamic neuron. And it's the job then of the third order sensory neuron on thalamic neuron to direct that information to the correct part of the primary somatosensory cortex for processing. Okay. All right, let's take a look at another pathway. So we're back to that same original drawing. I said you might want to have 2 or 3 examples, otherwise things might get a little bit messy. And this time, let's take a look at our posterior column pathway. So we're going to label this our posterior column pathway or tract. Instead of posterior, the OpenStax textbook calls it dorsal. Remember, this one is like huge because this is that entire posterior white column area, right? But we have our same pattern. So we're still collecting sensory information using that first order sensory neuron. But remember, this is that whole posterior white column. So we have like a ton of sensory information we're picking up here. So here we're picking up fine touch. We're picking up pressure. We're picking up vibration. We're picking up proprioception, right? And that information is traveling first order sensory neuron. That's part of your spinal nerve coming into your let's label our posterior root coming into our spinal cord. And now we're going to see something different. So now what we see happening is our axon. Our axon of that first order sensory neuron comes in and goes all the way up to the brainstem area. It's not until we get to the brainstem area that we're synapsing onto our second order sensory neuron, and we see this second order sensory neuron crosses and then goes up to the thalamus. So here's our second order sensory neuron, or we can call it an interneuron because it's a neuron between neurons. And now that we make it to the thalamus, we're going to synapse onto our thalamic neuron, which is going to direct that sensory information to the correct part of the primary somatosensory cortex. And notice I drew this axon kind of going in a different direction because maybe this is sensory information from a different part of the body. And so remember that neuron in the thalamus is called the third order sensory neuron, or we can call it the thalamic neuron. And so here, the thing that we see different is that the first order sensory neuron comes into the spinal cord and continues to ascend on the same side. It's not synapsing onto the second order until we get to the brainstem, and that's where decussation or crossing over occurs. And then we're back to our regular pattern of second order synapses on third order in the thalamus, and the thalamic neuron or third order sensory neuron directs it to the correct processing center. Okay, finally, we have one more diagram to look at or draw. And so in this one, we're going to be drawing out the Spino Cerebellar. So remember, you have actually anterior and lateral, and we're not going to differentiate between these in this course. So we're looking at both the anterior and the lateral spinocerebellar tracts. Of course, they're named anterior and lateral because one is located in the anterior white column and the other is located in the lateral white column. And we do see some key differences here in whether it comes in and crosses immediately or it decussates, after it crosses in. Some of this information decussates and some of it doesn't, is what we'll see actually. We still have our first order sensory neuron, and so remember it's still going to be traveling in the posterior root. Remember with the anterior and lateral spinocerebellar tracts, we're carrying proprioception information. This is from our muscles, our tendons, and our joints. So this is that position of our body in space. And what we're going to see is that first order sensory neuron is going to come in. It's going to synapse onto our second order sensory neuron. And here what I'm going to do is have it cross and come up. And then it's going to synapse at the cerebellum. So I'm going to go ahead and label this my second order sensory neuron. You can still call it an interneuron if you'd like, because it's going to synapse onto neurons in the cerebellum. Maybe let's draw that cerebellar neuron, just so we remember that that's happening. But the key thing here is that we're being processed at the cerebellum. So this is new, this is different. We haven't seen this before. So Spino Cerebellar is being named because it's coming into the spinal cord and then it's synapsing at the cerebellum. So this would be, an unconscious sensory processing that's happening. And it makes sense because cerebellum, remember, let's remind ourselves, is, I'm gonna put it in green here, it's giving us grace to our movements. It's smoothing out our movements and our posture. And so it's important that it's aware of how our body is positioned in space. All right, y'all, that's it for ascending tracts. Stay tuned for descending tracts. And as always, take care of yourselves and each other.